Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game. And these are the 5 ways to fix Quest Rogue. Now, if you've been playing Journey to Grow at all in the first few days of the expansion, you've probably ran into a Quest Rogue which runs the 2 cards, or essentially the 1 card you'll see on my screen here, which is the Caverns Below, the new quest. Once they play 4 minions of the same name via bouncing minions back into their hand, they get Crystal Core, which they then cast, and all of the minions that they play, all of the minions on their side of the board that are summoned automatically, all of them are 5/5s. And this deck has been finding some success on the ladder, and it's frustrating a lot of players. And I do think there are some ways to fix it. Now, before I get into that, I do want to say that some people out there are probably rightfully saying that this quest in this deck isn't broken, in the fact that it can very easily be beaten and maybe doesn't even necessarily have a fantastic win rate at this point. But much like Jade Druid in the past had the same argument in that the deck could be countered and the deck wasn't a dominant force on the ladder necessarily, that doesn't mean it's a healthy addition to the game, and I feel the exact same way about Quest Rogue as I do about Jade Druid. The way in which it wins feels really, really bad to lose to. Even though the deck draws really dead sometimes, and loses games because it can't find the bounce it needs to successfully complete the quest, you don't care about that when you're on the other end of the perfect hand where they get Crystal Core by like turn 3 or 4 and prep it out and you just have 0 routes to victory and it made no difference what you did. Your deck just didn't have the tools necessary to apply enough pressure to beat the Quest Rogue. So it's not really a matter of the Quest deck being average on the ladder. It's more about the fact that when it runs well, it's a completely destructive force that frustrates opponents into oblivion. In other words, I just want to dial back a little bit on the dominance of the deck when it draws well without really reducing the consistency of the effect. So I have 5 ways here that I'd like to propose to do that. My first suggestion is that minions which are already on the board for the Rogue, when they play Crystal Core, when they play the buff, those minions don't immediately get buffed. In other words, it has to be minions that come into play after that. So for instance, sometimes they'll already have, a Novice Engineer and a Swashbuckler on the board when they play Crystal Core, and then those are suddenly 5/5 minions. So essentially, you kind of cast Blessing of Kings on both of them, and they still get to immediately utilize those stats because they were already on the board and had initiative and were able to attack. Making it this way just slows down that big swing turn a little bit. Like the Rogue is already getting such a power swing from Crystal Core that they don't necessarily need the minions on the board to get the buff right away. They have charging minions in hand. There's still ways for them to utilize the buff very, very quickly. This just slows them down the slightest bit so that opponents who, when the turn gets passed back to them, can trade into those smaller minions very freely, get a little bit more time to set up. They might have 1 turn to establish a couple taunts to slow down chargers, might be able to find damage to kill them over the next turn or 2. It just dials it back 1 notch. I mean, it doesn't break the buff. It just reduces the speed with which the Rogue can spin up all the buffed minions. And I think that might be just enough to make it feel a lot better when you're playing against this deck. My next suggestion is that minions don't get buffed until the opponent's turn. So this is a little bit more drastic, but essentially how I would envision this working is the Rogue could play down a Stone Tusk Boar, but it would stay a 1/1 until you hit the end turn button, and then it would become a 5/5. So all the charging effects essentially that are available to Rogue right now with this quest would get limited by this. They'd still be 5/5s, they'd still be giant bodies that your opponent had to address the following turn, and they'd be 5/5s forever thereafter. It's just immediately upon playing them on any given turn throughout the course of the game, they don't get the benefit right away. So you, in other words, you get the stats and you still get all the raw value that Crystal Core provides, but you don't get the benefit of chargers in particular, which we've all seen. Stone Tusk Boar hit you for 5, Shadow Step, play it again, Stone Tusk Boar hit you for 5, Shadow Step, Stone Tusk Boar hit you for 5. And that is a particularly frustrating way to lose because it's essentially a 15 damage burst combo when you're already thinking about dealing with this giant board of cheap stuff that's coming out as 5/5s. So it just removes the potential for rogues to end the game really rapidly after they get the quest, which I don't think should be the strong suit of the quest. I think the strong suit of the quest should be a long-term value game from all these really high-tempo plays where they can play cheap minions and still get a lot of stats in the back end. So this sort of balances that out without really breaking what the quest is probably intended to do and just removing some of the burst damage potential. My third fix is actually a really subtle one, and that is that only minions that are played from your hand would actually get buffed. Now this wouldn't affect a vast majority of the things. You could still do the Stone Tusk Boars, you could still do the South Sea Deckhand Charge. Those are played minions that get buffed, but it would affect a couple specific instances. Patches that came out of your deck, for instance, wouldn't get buffed, although that's very unlikely because usually you get patches out by the time you actually get the quest completed thanks to Swashbuckler. But the real impact, I think, would be that anytime you polymorphed a minion or hexed a minion, it would stay small, right? It wouldn't instantly turn into a 5/5. So that's one little thing that some control decks could really take benefit from. Because right now, like for instance, an Elemental Shaman running Hex, if they hex one of these minions, they have to now deal with a 5/5 taunt. And it's a completely useless card. But if you hexed one and were able to clear it really cheaply and then send some more damage face, it would just 1 out of 10 times probably make the difference in a game and turn the corner. And that's really all the tweaking that this deck needs, is like maybe that 1 out of 10 times where it's a little bit less frustrating that could even things out some. There's also other instances where you can summon minions for your opponent. For instance, a warrior playing Cornered Sentry, summoning those little raptors is normally not a problem, but with Crystal Core on the board, you'd be summoning 3 5/5s, and that would totally suck. So this would dial back on that as well, and Leroy Jenkins is another example of that. But I think those are really, really, really niche instances where those would matter. It's more importantly about the polymorph style effects that make this tweak, although subtle, still important. My fourth suggestion might be one that a lot of people hate, and it's not my favorite either, but there's a way to just make the minion stats 4/4 instead of 5/5, and that could make a huge impact on how frustrating they are. A 4/4 minion is so significantly easier to kill than a 5/5, and 4 damage is a lot less threatening than 5 damage as well, because there's just a lot of 5 health stuff out there in the game. So the minions would have a little bit harder time trading in. They die more easily to a lot of common taunts out there. So this would just mean that decks had more ways to more effectively deal with it. Flame Strike, for instance, would clear a board instead of not clearing a board. It's pretty obvious, just a 20% nerf to what the card is actually accomplishing. It might go too far, if anything, but ultimately, if the deck is so frustrating to play against, if you can pull it back 20%, and that's really the smallest amount you can pull back the buff sensibly, you could maybe make them 4/5s or 5/4s as well. Could be an alternative, but I think that this would be enough to satisfy the player base who's frustrated by this card, but really would still give the Quest Rogue enough long-term punch and power with 4/4s that cheap and that effectively that it wouldn't break the deck. I think it would still be just fine. It'd just be a little bit worse and a little bit easier to play against. And then finally, for my fifth suggestion, I think this one's actually the most elegant, the easiest, and probably the most fair of all to the Quest Rogue. It is that simply Crystal Core, the actual buff spell, costs 6 mana to cast instead of 5 mana. And a lot of people will immediately say, yes, but all the quest rewards cost 5 mana. Well, who cares? That's totally arbitrary. That has nothing to do with game balance. That's just a flavor decision that Blizzard made. It has no mechanical implications whatsoever. Making it 6 mana would be totally fine. It would slow down the big swing turn at least a little bit, or at the very least would allow rogues to do fewer things in the turn they cast Crystal Core. So even if it was prepped outright, it would still cost a pretty big chunk of mana if they did it around turn 5 or 6, which is when they typically do it. You know, only play maybe 2 minions, 3 minions instead of like prep Crystal Core, still somehow play like 3 or 4 minions. Those kinds of turns can be incredibly frustrating. So this would just pull it back 1 mana, essentially. Slow them down by 1 mana. Not a huge change in the scheme of things, but occasionally would really help the opponent find some extra time and some extra resources to deal with the crazy effect that's about to happen. And it really, in these games, comes down to 1 or 2 turns. Is your opponent able to stabilize a board of taunts? Is your opponent able to find some damage to kill you before you get swinging with your Crystal Core buffs? So 1 or 2 turns and 1 or 2 mana is enough to turn the tide, often enough that this would be a pretty significant change. But again, I don't think it would destroy the deck. All that said, those are my changes for Quest Rogue that I think would make the deck more fun to play against, a healthier influence in the meta, but would still retain its competitive viability. Now, I know for a fact that these videos cause a lot of controversy out there, and a lot of people hate my suggestions. There are going to be complaints. That's good. I love discussion. I love the idea that you guys disagree. So share your take on not only my recommendations here, but your take on Quest Rogue in general. And maybe if you have a change you think would be much better, I want to hear about it. Leave all of that in the comments below. Feel free to discuss this to your heart's desire, because I want to hear it too. I want to see what you guys think about Crystal Core, Quest Rogue, how to change it, how to make it better. Is it a bad influence at all? So on and so forth. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.